When we say that a person has certain koyach nefesh, he's born with certain koyach nefesh, it means he's born with a certain status of neshama. That person has two types of koyach nefesh. He has koyach nefesh which are given. They're koyach nefesh which he can exhibit as an individual, and then he also has koyach nefesh which are potential. In other words, he has certain abilities or koyach which he may not have now, but which he can possess if he works up to that madrega. Those are potential koyach nefesh. Now, the given koyach nefesh are determined basically by a state right now. The potential koyach nefesh are determined by many things. It's determined fundamentally in what's called a range. In other words, a person has a certain range where he can go in terms of potential koyach nefesh, and he cannot go further. A person therefore can exhibit a certain amount of koyach nefesh within a given range. You see, in that range he can either move up or down, but he cannot go beyond his range in that way. So therefore, those are the potential koyach nefesh. Where do they come from? They come from, first of all, in terms of what his status was or ability was in terms of a previous tikkun. In other words, even though now he's born with a certain state, but because of the fact that he was always been assigned a great deal in previous Gilgulim, he has the ability now to be Tofes or to seize greater levels of Kedusha. He potentially has a great amount of Kedusha which he can get now if he works for it. You see. But since he has shaykhs to these higher levels, if he works for it, he has a higher level of this potential Shefa, so that there's a certain Shefa that comes down to him now that indicates the potential ability of what he can get if he works for it. Then there's also Shefa that relates to what's called Tov and Ra. We said that basically there are two koyches in the Bria, Ra and Tov, and the Baruch Shem created both, well, basically Ra, and he works with Tov and Ra, but basically to serve a specific tachlis. Now, in order for the Baruch Shem to be mative, he has to be mashpia a certain shefa which produces Tov. But for example, if the Baruch Shem wants to bring Yisurin in the world, then what happens is through the Sultan, he brings down a shefa of Ra, you see, which therefore causes damage or causes destruction. But Ra also has a shefa. Our world, which is the world we live in, is influenced by hashpos or shefa, which can either be l'toiv or can come from Ra, depending on what its objective is. Which means that just like Toiv has a shefa which influences us, Ra also has a shefa which is influences and so on. You see. So therefore the shefa process itself can reflect quite a number of different things. Now, what's very important to realize is when we take a certain specific individual, you see, and we say to him, what kind of music do you like? And he begins to describe a certain kind of music. He will be attached or become attracted to certain music because of different reasons. It could be, for example, that music, you see, reflects certain characteristics which are identical to his shefa of his given koyach nefesh. In other words, the music, in terms of the way it's being played, is such that it corresponds to his koyach nefesh as they mamish exist in him now, and therefore he's very much influenced or taken in by this. It's also possible that sometimes he listens to music and he becomes very inspired by the music. Not because it represents what he has now, but it represents what he could be. You see, if he struggles for it, it represents the height in which he can achieve. He has a sense of the high, of the sublime, of that which is yet in front of him, you see, if he works for it. It gives him the sensitivity of being in all its different variations, of existence, of what is to come, if he wants to establish it and work for it. So he's sensitive to not only the present level of existence, but the potential levels of existence that are yet possible if he works for it. And these potential levels of existence are also represented by Shefa. You see, they're represented by the Shefa, which would correspond to those levels if they actually existed. So sometimes the person is drawn to music because that music inspires him in terms of it somehow shows him what he can be and what he can achieve. It gives him a sense of being larger than himself or becoming attached to that which is bigger than himself. And he does it through music. Why? Because that music is not telling him now what he is, his koyach nefesh. It's pointing to the koyach nefesh of what he can become. You see, what he's a part of in terms of a totality, it points to a range of koich nefesh. Sometimes when a person listens to music, what he's attracted to music is telling him even yet a third thing. The movement of the melody and of the tones and of the rhythms and so on are such that they actually exemplify him the process of struggle to achieve a higher level of existence. You see, so the music as it goes up and down and so on and so forth and repeats itself in many different ways and changes in pitch and changes in highs and lows and changes in volume and so on, all represent to him a dynamic struggle of an existence which is constantly evolving. It's a shefa, not of a static state. It doesn't represent a state of koich nefesh as they are now, or koich nefesh of which they could be, but rather of a process of koich nefesh as they evolve. And it reflects the struggle itself. You see, in other words, you can play out the actual struggle in the evolution of existence through music. Because as music changes, you see, its representation of different shefa changes. And as it goes from one shefa to another, it's like the person is going from one madrega to another, as such. So therefore, through music, a person can, in a certain sense, connect to the experience of fighting and growing, even though he's not growing at all. You see. Because he's relating to the shefa. It's like a person watching a play. And he's watching a play about a struggle to go from a certain level of values, a certain level of existence to a higher level. And the play represents that which is possible. The play represents the scheme, it represents the plot, but it represents the struggle and the effort, you see, in which man attempts to elevate himself, to go from one level to another. Music can also symbolize that. It symbolizes that through the constant movement and variation of different levels of ashpah, as such. And finally, also, music reflects fundamentally the shefa of Ra and Toiv. In other words, when we say that music has four characteristics, these characteristics are true of the shefa process. But just like they're true of the shefa process, they're not only true of the shefa process of Toiv. Because fundamentally, all shefa relates to either one of two origins. Either it relates to Toiv or relates to Ra. That's the fundamental division of shefa in terms of its basic quality. You see, music is also a reflection. So therefore, if a person listens to music, there are certain types of music which a person can listen to. And as he listens to the music, he seems to be noiter, or he seems to be inclined to doing chatoim. He's inclined to gaiva. Suddenly he doesn't know why, but when he listens to a certain kind of music, he feels like getting up and running out and doing a chet. He feels noiter to taiva, or to gaius, or arrogance, you see. And he doesn't know why. He seems to have been inspired by the music alone to do it, you see. As if the music activated something. And sometimes a person will listen to music and it has the opposite effect. He's inspired to avoida. He's inspired to tremendously sublime thoughts, to chokhmah, to much higher asrogas, to toiv, to beauty, you see. And that's also in the music. Why? Because the music will reflect the shefa of Ra or the shefa of toiv. And as it reflects that shefa, you see, it will stimulate the individual to those directions. Just like Kedusha has the concept of tferes and oiz in it, so can music. Sometimes music, when it's heard, has a concept of tferes. Sometimes when you listen to music, you say, that music seems to reflect the essence of beauty itself, of incredible harmony, of things blending together, forming an incredible whole. There's a tremendous tferes that comes out of the music. Sometimes the music symbolizes strength or extreme power. Sometimes it symbolizes majesty and such. Why? Because music is able to symbolize or parallel the shefa. And it's that shefa which can either be of toiv or of ra, or of different qualities of strength, chokhmah, and so on. You see. So since music can parallel all these aspects of the shefa process, music can do all of these things for us. It can either stimulate us to our own koich nefesh. It can stimulate us to drive towards goals which are beyond our koich nefesh, but within the realm of our potential. It can stimulate us and give us the experience of a dynamic struggle going on now. It can give us the inclinations toward toiv and ra and so on. You see, music is capable of doing all this. Why? Because what does all these things basically is shefa. The shefa that comes down to a person is what determines all these things. And since music is the reflection of that shefa, it's capable of in some way duplicating the experience of that Shefa in certain ways, so that even though these things are not actually occurring, it's able to mobilize the experience itself, the mental experience, as if these things were happening. Let's give an example of the music to try and see if we can't get some kind of understanding of this. An example is the Revolutionary Etude by Chopin. Yes. Kind of music. Fundamentally, what we see is interesting, that the music starts at a high. It starts at a very powerful series of strokes where the volume and the pitch is higher, you see, and then suddenly it begins to roll back down. So in other words, the music starts off with a high elevated goal, and then it rolls back down as if we start off at a position that suddenly makes us alert. When we hear the first series of notes, what happens? We become inspired, in a sense. We sit up, we listen. This is where I want to be. In a certain sense, this is where one is supposed to be and really feel strong and feel muslim. But suddenly we begin to fall back down. Why? Because this elevation is an inspired goal. It's a goal, it's not a reality. So we fall down and we roll down. But as soon as we roll down, we don't want to stay there, so we jump back up. But then again we roll down. And then after we roll down the second time, we stay down for a little while, kind of guarding our strength, and then we jump up again. But once we jumped up the third time again, we don't come back down as far, you see. So we kind of go again back up, but from a shorter point up. We kind of level out in a sense, you see. So when we begin to see that the music basically differs in a certain sense by volume, and it's a melody which differs in volume and pitch. But the pitch and volume gives it a sense from that which is lower to that which is higher. And as such, it begins to define the range of where our koyach nefesh can go, in terms of the aliyah of the person. That's number one. And then as the music flows, we can begin to feel the struggle between the high and the low. You see? Between first starting high, falling back down, swirling in the bottom, gathering our strength, jumping high, and this time falling back, but not as far. You see? And then going back up. You see? So in other words, when we listen to the tones of the music, it actually symbolizes the entire movement from within, in terms of the struggle to achieve a higher existential state, and not being able to, and struggling towards that existential state. And all this is done by a series of tones. But how? How do sounds do that? You see, basically, because of the parallelism which exists between the characteristics of the music and the characteristics of the Shefa, is because of the fact that sounds parallel the Shefa plus itself in their basic structural features, that one is able to become a structural parallel to the other. And by listening to one through sensation, by letting one going through our ears and listening to it, it suddenly begins to vitalize our internal experience. How? Because it corresponds to the Shefa itself, either to our own Shefa, or to Shefas which are yet potential, or to Shefas which represent a dynamic movement of the Shefas themselves as they go from high to low, you see. All these things are replicated by musical sounds. Now there are many different types of music that can replicate many different types of hashpah processes. But fundamentally that's what music is. It is a replication or a physical counterpart to the Shefa process itself. And as many variations and nuances exist in the Shefa process itself, can also be reflected in the many variations that exist in music also. Language of Pneumius. We relate to our Pneumius through the language of Shefa. Shefa tells us what we're capable of. Shefa tells us what we are right now. You see, there are sports which are sent down to us constantly, which make us to be what we are and tell us what we are right now. It defines our actuality. But there are hashpos that constantly come down that don't relate to our actuality. It relates to what we can be, you see. And we know what we can be by these hashpos themselves, the oris that come down, that constantly stimulate us and tell us what we're capable of, what we should aspire to, not what we are now. The hashpos which also tell us feelings of what tov is, because they tell us what experience of tov is. The hashpos that tell us what inyan of ra is, you see. And that they're finding the combination of different hashpos as they move through the person between what he is and what he can be. And the progression of Shefa as he goes through life also begin to tell us the dynamic process of going from one step to another. You see, all this is reflected in the variations of the Shefa. Shefa is the language of the pneumius. It's the language of the inner being, of the inward experience. And what corresponds to that is music. In the sense that music, because it parallels the characteristics of that Shefa, you see, can inspire us to begin to experience those hashpos without really knowing what that is. We don't know when we feel very magnetized by music and mesmerized. We don't know that when we're listening to it, it's because suddenly, what do you call it? We're being mesmerized because suddenly we're feeling a whole set of hashpos that are coming in, that is invigorating and reinforcing the hashpos which we're feeling at that moment or what we can feel. We don't know that. All we know is we feel very strange and very different. We feel very moved, you see. We don't know why. That's because music, which is a chatzonistic instrument, it's a language of sound, it's an acoustical phenomena, has the capacity, you see, to mobilize the internal language, which is the language of the neshama through the Shefa process itself. That is the union of the two. That is the association of the two, and that's why the two, because of the two of them, we can use one fundamentally to engage the other. But just like music, you see, can invigorate Shefa, it is possible sometimes for Shefa to go the other way. In other words, if different types of music, you see, can stimulate different types of Shefa, it's possible if we understood the chokhmah of Shefa, if we understood the language of that Shefa, to construct a Shefa which represents the highest aspect of a person, the greatest tov that he can be, and then retranslate that into music. You see, if we did that, it is possible to create a series of tones. It is possible to create a music which, when we listen to it, can mamish give us, to a certain extent, the sipuk of Olam Haba. This is an extraordinary thing, and I want you to note very carefully what I'm saying. You see, music is a reflection of the Shefa process as it's going on in all its different variations. However, if we can understand the highest types of hashpah, you see, and then we can translate that hashpah into music, and then we listen to that music can actually stimulate the highest religious, spiritual feelings in a person. It's possible that if a person could be in tune with his own Shefa and translate that Shefa into music, that he can then use that music to be ma'ira, tremendous devekas to many, many people. You see. So therefore, to understand the language of music is to understand the language of Shefa. And to understand the language of Shefa is to give us the ability to write it in the language of music, you see, which then can be used to produce that Shefa in others. This is the emes chokhmah of music. All of music, not only its characteristic, its chords, its harmonics, and so on, its scales, its keys, every aspect of music and so on, is nothing more than the language of sound which duplicates the language of Shefa. Music not only inspires us, but more important, it's very important for the intellect. When we listen to music, it's very critical for experience. But music as a chokhmah is an incredible opportunity to understand how the Shefa works. What is the language of the Shefa? What are the kinds of hashpos are there and so on? And how does it affect a person? To understand music is to understand the entire Shefa process itself. That is the essence of music itself. And by understanding this, you see, it is a tremendous chokhmah. And to use this begins to give us the chokhmah of ruchnis itself as well. Since music is only a duplication or a replication of the Shefa process itself, when you hear certain music, you see, that inspires you and kind of talks to you and lets you in on what's possible, on the sublime, and on the beautiful, and on the majestic, you see. But what it cannot do is tell you how to get there, because all music does is simply allow you to experience it, but it does not give you the information you need to actually achieve it. That's not the function of music. Music is nothing more than an image in the mirror. That's all it is. It simply shows you what you are and what you can be. That's all. It's an image, you see. But it is not a path. It's not a direction. It's not an instruction. It's not a guidance. It does not teach you how to get there whatsoever. That is the chesron of music. But in the sense that it's an image of a shefa, and of all different types of shefa, its chokhmah is the key to that shefa process. If music is the image and the reflection of a shefa process, what is a composer? Basically, a composer is an individual who is able to listen to the internal shefa process itself and translate into musical sounds. A composer, a creator, a Beethoven or a Mozart, are people who have certain kinds of channels, you see, channels to that shefa process in a very direct way. We can all experience the shefa in the sense that when we hear the music, it stimulates us, it inspires us, but we are not sensitive to the very movement of the shefa itself as it's going on, you see. Only from the music do we have a feel of what the shefa is like. But a musical genius, a true creative person, a composer, has the ability to listen to the shefa process itself, you see. His soul, his neshama, can actually listen to the shefa process and translate that into music, you see. He can do the reverse. Now, he doesn't know that he's listening to a shefa process as such. He doesn't. But he can directly access that shefa process in the sense that he can hear something from the distance and he can hear the music coming out of that shefa process, so to speak, and he simply writes it down. He doesn't need music to inspire him, you see. He hears something from within. There's something inside him which inspires him and comes out as music. With us, with listeners, we hear music and then it inspires us from within, you see. His inspiration is first in his panemius, and then it's expressed as a chetzonius, you see. With us, we hear it as a chetzonius, and then it inspires us into our panemius. That's the essence of a musical genius or a great composer. Beethoven, who produced music which has tremendous majesty and grandeur and tiferes and so on, and all these qualities, somehow was connected with the kind of shefa process that reflected this, and he was able to listen to it, not in his head, but his neshama was able to listen to it, and as his neshama listened to that kind of shefa, his brain recorded the music in a parallel way, and he simply wrote that down. And then we go and hear Beethoven, and suddenly we're inspired with all the dynamic force that he was inspired by listening to the subtleties of the shefa process itself. What we basically discussed this time is the parallelism between music and the shefa process. What we have to discuss, which is really critical, is this: what is the connection between music and the hashkocha process itself? But the answer should be much clearer to us. Why? Because fundamentally it's the hashkocha which determines the shefa, the kind of shefa which will come down. So in some way the music is a reflection of the specific hashkocha at that time. We will go into that more specifically in detail. Basically, we see from this discussion that music is a reflection of the shefa process, and that a person is attracted to the shefa process which most strongly is identical to his own, also to the shefa process which is most strongly identified with the range of his kochas hanefesh, and so on. This also explains another interesting phenomena. Why is it that music not only produces different effects in different people, but also the phenomena which we also saw in terms of, especially in modern day periods of rock concerts and so on, where people listen to a musician and it's almost a form of worship, in a sense. And the reason is the circumstance that we see in rock concerts and in just in general, the immensely powerful influence that music and rock composers and rock and roll singers have had on America and Europe, all Western civilization, almost out of proportion with the medium of music itself, is because of the fact that music is a corresponding aspect of a shefa. Meaning that when you have a rock star playing a certain music, creating sounds in a certain way, and the people are listening to these sounds, and these sounds are very much in tune with their own shefa, what it is that they suddenly are able to hear their own shefa much more powerfully. So it produces a certain internal animation. Suddenly their very essences, the neshamas, become much more chiastic. You see, what's called resonance. The music is like resonating with the shefa of each person's neshama. And since many of these people are neshamas which are in tune with lower types of shefa, or other people who have higher neshamas but they're in tune with these shefas which are similar to the koiches of Ra in certain ways, it brings out these koiches in a different person, and they feel drawn to this type of music. That's why they look at the rock star in such a almost like a worshipping way. Why? Because fundamentally what the rock star is doing by playing this music is the same thing that the Bonisham does when he plays his music. But what's the Bonisham's music? The Bonisham's music is the hashpah, the shefa. When the Bonisham is mashpia on the world, different types of hashpahs, right? The whole spectrum of all different types of hashpahs. What fundamentally the Bonisham is doing is playing music. That's his music. His music is all the hashpahs that go on, the variation and constant movement, you see, of hashpahs is the Bonisham's music. And what that does, that animates the neshamas. So in the same parallel, when people listen to a concert and they hear these stars, these rock stars play this kind of music, they look at these rock stars as the source of that hashpah. So they look at them as what? What is the source of hashpah? A god, you see. So in a certain way, people begin to look at these stars in a way that they seem to have almost divine powers in a way, and they idealize them in a very powerful fashion. Because the process of the concert is very similar to the process of the Bria. That's a strange parallel, I realized. To say that the parallel that a singer has when he carries his audience in that motion is similar to the mashpia mushpa relationship that the Bonisham has with his Bria, especially with the Minanushi, with Adam, is a very strong, very strange parallel. But fundamentally that's what it is. That's why in a rock concert you have a certain aspect of worship, you see, where they adulate the rock star to very high proportions. We all know, rock stars walk around like they're almost like exempt from all the regular troubles of life in certain ways, and it's almost like a glitter which surrounds them, a glitter of enormous success and power and recognition, out of proportion with the fact that some guy is up on a stage strumming a guitar or whatever have you, and beating a drum. What does this have to do? Why all of a sudden? Because the guy beats the drum in a certain way and plays an electric guitar in a certain way, and suddenly 50,000 people rise from their seats and go crazy, screaming the man's name, like some kind of avodah zarah. Now, this is a clear phenomenon. Anyone who's known anything about Woodstock, I think, how many people gathered there? I think about 1 million people were at Woodstock. Listen to this thing. Anyone who knows these phenomena sees it clearly, but the question is why? Why does it exist? So I was to explain the fact that it parallels the Shefa process. And because it parallels it, the behavior is the same. It parallels the behavior, so therefore the behavior of that kind of concert, the relationship between the people who hear the music and the people who play the music have a similar type of behavioral pattern, which is an aspect almost of religious worship. Because a rock concert clearly is almost a religious ritual. It's almost like an avodah in a certain sense. And that's what it is basically. What's very important to realize is another yesod about music, which is very critical. Since music is the reflection of the Shefa process, we must realize that there are two types of hashpahs. There's the hashpah which comes from Kedusha, the hashpah of Ruchnius, and it's the hashpah of Kedusha, which basically brings everything in the world which has shaykhs to Toiv, and to Tferes, and to Yichud. And then there's another hashpah, the hashpah of the Sitra Achra, which relates to Ra, and pain, and pure separation. Now music is a reflection of Shefa, period. Any Shefa. The characteristics of music in its pitch, volume, rhythm and qualities are a reflection in certain ways of any type of Shefa. Whether that Shefa be of Ra, Toif or Ra. And it is possible to construct musical patterns which are true reflections of Koyach HaTumah. Now you may say, how is that? Well, we know that from our own experience. There are certain types of music that we listen to that elevate us, that give us a feeling of the sublime, a feeling of dignity. And when we hear this, we feel like somehow we've been connected with something higher than ourselves. You see. But also, there are many times we can hear certain types of music, especially rock and roll and disco type of music and so on, where there's a very heavy emphasis on beat and so on and so forth. When we feel suddenly very different, we feel very connected to ourselves, to our inner tivus, to our inner feelings, to our inner power and our inner arrogance, our inner sense of macho and masculinity or femininity, whatever the story is, you see. We feel connected to a certain base aspect, psychological aspect of our own personalities, rather than something sublime, something higher than ourselves. And we say to ourselves, why is it that one music provokes this kind of feeling and the other type of music provokes this kind of feeling? The answer, I believe, is because music is a neutral item. Music is not makabel tumah. It's a neutral item. All it is, it's a reflection. It's like an image in the mirror. An image in the mirror has nothing to do with what the image is, whether that image is a rasha or a tzaddik, right? The mirror simply reflects what's back. It's neutral. It's not pejorative. It has no value judgment as such. The same thing music. Music simply reflects to a shefa which is at hand, or it could be at hand. Music can therefore reflect shefa of Torah or shefa of Ra. You see. It is the essence of the study of music to understand how do the musical elements, the notes and musical notation, language and so on and so forth, how do all the various structures of music, how does it explain the shefa process? How does it correspond to the shefa? That's number one. And if we can understand this deeper, to understand what characteristics of music are closer to the shefa of Ra, and what characteristics of music are closer to the shefa of Toiv. This is an interesting point. And I am not, my knowledge of music is limited, but from my one experience that I seem to find is that it seems that the notion of melody or pitch, in a certain sense, melody seems to relate more to the aspect of toiv and beat. The concept of beat and rhythm seems to relate more to the aspect of Ra, emphasis on one versus emphasis on the other. You see. But like I say, there are many variations and there are many possibilities. It's very hard to put a specific stamp on it. This requires an immense study. But the whole chachma of Nagina, which is the study of music, is nothing more than the study of the revelation of those Shefa prophecies. That's all it is. If you could enter the genius of music, if you could enter the inner chachma of music, you could understand the very nature of the Shefa process itself and what constitutes the Shefa of Ra and the Shefa of Tov. With this Hakdama, we can now go further and explain other very important questions that we've asked before. One question that we've asked is, why is it different nations of the world produce different types of music? You see. Now, the answer to that basically has to do with Ummah Olam. Different nations of the world are differences in what factor? Basically, there are differences in what's called Koyach HaNefesh of the Ummah. We've said a long time ago that basically the world is composed of 70 different Ummahs. 71 actually, with Klal Yisrael. And the 70 Ummahs Olam, the 70 Goyim, and the one nation of Klal Yisrael, all are differentiated by a factor called Koyach HaNefesh. In other words, what is the source of their power? What is the source of their roots? What is their source, that is, what their shurish? All the nations of the world differ by what their source is, how it's connected to Ruchnis itself. All the 70 nations of the world are connected to spiritual forces that will relate heavily to Ra, to Tumah, to the Koyach of the Situl Achar. And we're not going to go into it, but we related that back in time by the union of Vom and the Ummah Olam by Noach and so on. That the Ummah Olam lost their chelik of Olam Haba as such, and they were given a different chelik in Olam Hazeh, and as such they are no longer connected to that Kedusha which is necessary to bring this world to a level of Olam Haba. Because of that, their neshamas are different. They do not access themselves to that power, you see. So the kochos nefesh of the goyim are such that they're very limited. They're limited in terms of the subtlety and the sensitivity to kedusha. Therefore, they're limited to the subtlety of uris in that way. Now, technically speaking, they would also be limited to the subtlety of teferes and ois, which are the two characteristics of kedusha: the ability to be matzliach and the ability to be matzig chochma, or the yichud habor and the bria. Klal Yisrael, because of its kedusha, has tremendous shaychus to these ois. So, in other words, Klal Yisrael is connected to a very high level of kedusha in that way. Thus, the 70 nations of the world are different in terms of the shefa that comes to them. The kochos nefesh of each ummah is a reflection of the shefa which is receiving from its shorish. You see, obviously, music, which is the reflection of the shefa process, would have to be different for each of the nations of the world. You see, if each of the ummahs of the world, as such, relate in a different way to a different level of shefa, if its shefa differs by pitch, so to speak, by how high that shefa is, and by quality and all these other things, obviously the music that the West will produce is very different than the shefa of the music that the East will produce. You see, the East, China and India and all these countries have a totally different shefa process. So their music must be reflected in a different way. This then explains the geographical variation of music in the world, that different ummat ha'olam produce different types of music, and that is the composers of those nations who have the ability to key in to the music of that nation, because they're able to key in, you see, in an abstract way to the shefa which is shaykhs to that ummah. That's the concept of the geographical variation, you see, and the geographical variation of music. What about the chronological variation? If the different nations of the world produce different music because their shefa are different, why is it that the same nation will produce different music over time? You see, you'll find that in any specific nation, in various different ages or in different generations, different musical forms come out, like in America. Rock and roll was only a phenomenon of the last 30 years. Before that, there was the bands, the swing bands of the 40s, and before that, I forget what they called those types of music. Then there was jazz, and then there was ragtime. I mean, the music differs over the ages. What causes the hashkocha to influence different types of musical forms? You see, over the period of time. Basically, this also has to do with the kochos nefesh. But in this case, it's not the kochos nefesh which came to each ummah, or that ummah, from the beginning of time, in terms of the time by the biblical times. Rather, it has to do with the specific relationship that ummah has to the tikkun of the world. You see, over time, every nation, every ummah has a certain tachlis in the bria. Every nation starts out with a certain kochos nefesh, a certain shorish, and it is its function in some way to develop itself, to grow, to become close to ruchnius. You see, basically. So therefore, it is the function of every nation to try and masaken itself, so that its kochos nefesh are elevated. Now, as a nation succeeds in that elevation, perforce its music must change. If it fails in that elevation, if it declines in ruchnius, its music must also show it. So the music, therefore, is a reflection also of what's called the dynamic process of how that nation is changing and evolving in respect to its tikkun process. You see, is it building up more kilkul, or is it building more tikkun? You see, which one is it doing? That's going to reflect itself also in the shefa process, and thus it will reflect itself in musical cultural activities. Therefore, nations themselves will change over time, depending on what shaykhs they have to avodah, to their own tikkunim. If they're such that they're on the rise, they're going up in the ruchnius, then their music will tend to become closer to the shefa, reflect the shefa, which has to do with kedusha and tov. But if they're going down, they're declining it, then the music they will produce in that particular era, that particular time, will reflect the music which corresponds to a Shefa of Rav, you see. Whatever that correspondence is. So that basically is an understanding of the chronological variation as regards to musical development. That over a period of time, the same age will produce different music, depending on what its matzav is, what its status is relative to the tikkun of its kochas hanefesh of that ummah. So we have a better understanding of the geographical and chronological variation of musical development and musical forms. But fundamentally, all this rests on the basic premise in which we established at the beginning, that music is a reflection of the Shefa process. And the Shefa process is the direct medium of the Hashkocha process, you see. So therefore music will be the reflection of the Hashkocha process, or in some way will indicate what the Hashkocha is at that point in time. And of course, the Hashkocha at any point in time depends on the Maaseh Adam, you see. Depends on what man does. Man himself determines the Hashkocha that comes on top of him. So this is clearly where music interfaces with the Hashkocha process, through the Shefa process. The question here, one question that we really must also ask is that if music is a reflection of a Shefa, and let's say for example we have a certain individual, and that person has a certain status in terms of a specific koach hanefesh and a certain range of koach hanefesh that he has shaykhs to. If music represents a person's specific matzav in terms of the current koach hanefesh and the range or the potential koach hanefesh which he shaykhs to, why is it that when a person hears this music that he suddenly becomes more it stimulates the person? Why does it stimulate him when he hears music which is an image of his Shefa? Basically, because a person is korov eitzarat moy. A person is consumed with basically his own self-interest, and a person is attracted to that which is similar to himself. And when a person hears music, you see, which is similar to his very essence, or his very koyach which is coming into him, he finds it's very stimulating, it's vivifying. Because what it is, it's also a resonant factor. What it is, it's like two notes which somehow blend together and strengthen both of them at the same time. When a person hears the music which corresponds to a Shefa, there's a resonant effect, in the sense that the music creates a greater awareness of the Shefa itself and invigorates it, makes it more powerful. And because of that, he's more tuned to a Shefa. And as a result, he feels it stronger, in the sense that he feels its experiential manifestations better. This is why I believe that when a person hears music, which is his own musical signature, so to say, it arouses him and stimulates him to a stronger level. It kind of says, it places an emphasis on his being. It focuses his being and his manifestation to a stronger level of consciousness and awareness. So what's important, basically, at this point, is that we see that the kochas hanefesh, which differ from one nation to another, is responsible for the variations in music that we see from different nations. Number one. Number two, the different status in the kochas hanefesh in terms of their tikkunim of the different nations also create variations in music over periods of time. So we see two factors which govern musical development. One, the factor of kochas hanefesh, and two, the factor of the tikkun process, which is and the consequence which is being developed. This also determines musical development. But in truth, the matter is even more complicated than that. Why is that? Because of the peculiar relationship that Klal Yisrael has with the Ummah Olam. It's not enough to understand how music is related or reflects the different Kochos HaNefesh. It's not enough also to understand how music relates or reflects the status of Tikkun, how high the nation is at that point in time. We also have to see music in terms of what's called the Alvuvia. What do I mean by that? We know distinctly that Klal Yisrael has a specific relationship with the Ummah Olam. We've gone over this a number of times. Basically, all the Ummah Olam, the 70 Ummah Olam, have no shaykhs to Olam Haba, only Olam Hazeh. Only Klal Yisrael has shaykhs to Olam Haba in the sense that they can create Olam Haba. If Klal Yisrael fails in its attempt to do that kind of thing, if they fail in their efforts at establishing a tikkun, then they come under the dominion or a certain domination of the law, of a certain tumah. Now, their kedusha, or part of their kedusha, leaves them, and it goes away. And we know from the Hanagas HaYichud that kedusha goes into the hands of the Sultan himself. Now, once this happens, we see therefore a very peculiar phenomena. Because the Shefa of the Sitra Achra is a certain type of Shefa. That Shefa will produce Ra. But what happens if the Shefa of the Sitra Achra himself is combined with certain hashport of Kedusha which he took from Klal Yisrael because of the Chet? That means that the Shefa of the Sitra Achra itself will be a unique blend of Kedusha and Tumah. That's the concept of the Arvuvia, or the concept of the Or B'Soich HaKlipa, which we discussed amply before. But that means a very interesting thing. We understand that music comes. To repeat this again, we understand the concept of Shefa of Ra and the concept of Shefa of Toiv. And we understand that music, being a reflection of Shefa, in some way can reflect both of these things. Certain musical forms will reflect both of these hashpors. But now we're talking about a new type of hashpor. Hashpor of Buvya. It's a hashpor of Ra, of Tumah, with Kedusha in it. It's a hashpor of Kedusha B'Soich HaTumah, or Kedusha in the Klipa. It's a Shefa of Al-Buvya, which is coming from the Sultan. That's a whole different thing than just Shefa Ra or Shefa Kedusha. Obviously, since it's also a Shefa process, it itself must have a musical form which corresponds to it as well. Not only that, to the degree that the Al-Buvya exists, to that degree the music will change. So therefore there must be musical forms which will correspond to every level of proportion between Tov and Ra in its Al-Buvya manifestation. This is a very critical item. Why? Because the truth of the matter is, all of human history is nothing more than hashpos of Al-Buvya. That's really what it is. There is really, very rarely, since the Chet of Adam Rishon, there has never been a Shefa which is pure Kedusha, or a Shefa which is pure Ra. Ra and Kedusha were totally separate only before the Chet of Adam Rishon. Since that Chet, and since the Tumah went into the Bria, every hashpor is composed of both. And as the generations get further and further away from the beginning of time, the Avuvia becomes greater and greater. As Klal Yisrael does more and more Chatoim, the Tigboris Hara, or the Rishus of the Sultan, becomes greater and greater. That means a very important thing, that fundamentally the various Ummahs Olam become part of this Avuvia process. So therefore, what we have to look around is something else. Which Ummahs Olam, which nations of the world, which Goyish nations reflect the Avuvia? And this is where we really begin to see it. There are two types of Goyish Ummahs. There are certain Goyish nations which do not have shaykhs to the Avuvia directly. In other words, those Ummahs Olam correspond to the Kochos HaNefesh that they had from the time of Noach, at that time. Because they're not involved with the Avuvia, they don't receive the Kedusha of Klal Yisrael. They are not receptacles of the Kedusha of Klal Yisrael, so that they have to return it back to Klal Yisrael by persecuting them. They're outside the domain of the Hanagas HaYichud as such. They have the Kochos HaNefesh, what they had since the time of Noach, since the time of Avon when they were established. And they never were involved in the process of redeeming Klal Yisrael itself. those nations have hashpah of Ra, and the hashpah that they have is relatively pure. So the music that they will produce will fundamentally be a music which is almost a direct reflection of the Shefa of Ra. But there's another set of Ummas Olam, and these Ummas Olam are very different. These Ummas Olam, because of the fact that in some way they have Shaykhs to Kedusha, because they come from Esav and Yishmael, they will serve as the Klip of Klal Yisrael. They will serve as the receptacle of the Kedusha that Klal Yisrael loses through the Chatoim and through the Kippur. And as they become the receptacle of that Kedusha, when they persecute the Jews, they bring that Kedusha back. But obviously, since they are the receptacle of that Kedusha, their Shurish, their Hashpah, is one of a great Avuvia. So therefore, their music must be one of an Avuvia. In other words, in terms of the Koyches HaNefesh, which have to do with that Ummah itself, in its own Shurish, it would have a very low Shefa, because it's a very low Ummah. But since it's now the receptacle of the Oros of Klal Yisrael, you see, and its Shefa has a high Avuvia with Kedusha, its music that will produce will be much more sublime, you see, than the nation would normally be capable of under its own natural koyches and its own given structure, because it usurps the koyach of Kedusha of Klal Yisrael and incorporates it within its own culture. This therefore will explain that even among the Goyim themselves, that the different music that they produce is not only because the Goyim differ in terms of their fundamental or basic koyches nefesh, in terms of what they received from the time of Noach, but also because of the function that certain Ummas Olam have to do in its relationship to Klal Yisrael. Those Ummas who have no Shaykh to Klal Yisrael and do not relate to the aspect of Anogas Yichud, their music reflects their Shefa, which is a fundamentally basic Shefa Shel Ra. But the Ummas Olam that were chosen to be involved with Klal Yisrael as a receptacle, their Shefa will be one of Avuvia. So therefore their music will incorporate very great and sublime elements that have to do with Tiferes and Oiz, that normally that nation would not have Shaykhs to, under its own terms. So therefore, in order to understand musical variation, geographically and chronologically, one must first distinguish between the Goyish nations and say, this nation, how does it relate to Klal Yisrael? Is it a nation which receives the Shefa of Klal Yisrael when there's a Kitrug on it? Or is it a nation which does not receive it and has to exist on its own terms? That would make a very big difference in terms of the Shefa, which is Shaykhs to it. And it will make a very big difference between the music that it produces. Let's try and give some examples of what I'm talking about, basically. Let's give some examples. The nations of the world which have very little Shaykhs to Klal Yisrael, basically are the nations of Africa and many of the Asian and Eastern nations. Their Shaykhs to Klal Yisrael is very minimal. The Orient, the whole Far East, and the African nations basically have very little Shaykhs to Klal Yisrael. Therefore, the music of those nations would probably tend to be very pure in a certain way, that it would fundamentally reflect the koyches nefesh of those ummahs themselves. However, Western Europe and the West, Western civilization, all the nations of Europe and many of the nations on have had a direct connection with Klal Yisrael. As such, the music of the West will be a very powerful avuvia in this regard. A classic example of this is Germany. Germany basically has a great deal to do with the lowest elements of Esav, and in many cases it has to do with Amalek. Amalek is the lowest part of Esav, and Amalek, as we said once before, there are many parts of Esav. The neshama, the koyches nefesh of Esav as such, has different madregas. The lowest and worst madrega of all is Amalek, and that's such a low madrega that is pure Ra itself. Pure Ra. Now, what we have said in our previous shiurim is that Amalek is the insurance policy that Klal Yisrael will always exist, and that Amalek is the one nation which will receive the Oros of Klal Yisrael if Klal Yisrael goes all the way down to the end, which is Be'ita, down to very close to the case. Which means that we would expect that a nation like Germany, which has the lowest elements of Esav and Amalek itself, not all of Germany is Amalek, but Amalek is part of Germany, we would expect that somehow Germany would begin to go on the rise up in the Avuvia at a point in time when Klal Yisrael would need it for its redemption. And since Klal Yisrael doesn't really have to come onto Amalek in a very large capacity until the end of the Golus of Esav, which is close to the case itself, namely in the last several hundred years, we wouldn't think that Germany would have any shaykhs to a great deal of the Kedusha of Klal Yisrael. And the truth of the matter is it didn't. But in the 16th, 17th century, suddenly a very strange thing happened. Music came of age. And the first great musician, Johann Sebastian Bach, and Haydn and so on, began the revolution in music and began to create the musical forms that we know today. The symphonies, the symphonic forms, concertos, and all the forms that we have today began to be produced in the 1600s as such. Now, what basically was happening, obviously, is that there was a tremendous revolution in music. Where did this revolution come from? Germany, in and of itself, has no shaykhs to music of a high form, because it represents the lowest Shefa of Ra. But if Germany suddenly produces the most sublime music, obviously it's getting this in Klal Yisrael, which means that Amalek and Esav is producing a music which corresponds to a Shefa that it's not really getting, or that has no shaykhs to it. The truth is that Shefa that it's getting is the Shefa of the Avuvia, it's the Shefa of Klal Yisrael. And since there's so much Kedusha that they're getting, their music tends to be very sublime. What happened in the 16th, 17th century in Klal Yisrael? Well, if you remember, we went into the whole mice of Shabbat Tzvi and the whole Indian of the Ari. When in the 16th, 17th century, Klal Yisrael was Metzugal again for the Yemos Mashiach. The whole inception, the beginning of the Ari and the Kabbalah, and the whole beginning of the Chochmas Panemius and so on, and the Spashtus of that all was the beginning of it. But because of the Kitrug, that entire all was swallowed up, so that the Kabbalah went underground, it was swallowed up. Shabbat Tzvi came out as a distortion of the Messianic process, and the Koichas of Kedusha, the Tiferes and Oiz, went into the hands of the Goyim even more powerfully. And what we find in the 16th century is two astonishing revolutions. One, the scientific revolution, which was by Newton and Galileo, which happened at the same time as the Ari and Chaim Vital, at the time that they were living, and also the musical revolution, in the terms of Bach and so on. And the entire 18th century, the whole 1700s, you found the greatest musicians at the time, where you had Haydn and then you had Mozart and Beethoven. All of them lived in that time. It's like there was a tremendous espastus of musical genius suddenly on Germany. Suddenly. And there was a tremendous espastus of scientific genius on other nations, specifically on England and France. It's interesting to note that when the Oris of Klal Yisrael split and left Klal Yisrael to the hands of the Goyim, it's interesting to note that the Oris which corresponds to music went to Germany more, and the Oris which corresponds to Chochmah went more to England and France. Because the heavy scientific involvement in the world at the time was in those countries, England, France, and I believe also Italy. But Germany seems to have picked up the Shefa, which has to do with the Avuvia, which has to do with related music. And in some way, Germany seemed to have the most purest form of that Shefa in a certain way, so that it was able to reflect it in its music. The Shefa of all the Ummahs at that time, the Shefa of England, France, Italy, and Germany, in terms of the scientific and musical revolution, obviously was a Shefa which was taken from Klal Yisrael. It didn't belong to these nations. But since these nations are chosen constantly to be a receptacle for the Kedusha of Klal Yisrael, so that they can give it back by persecutions, they are the nations which will receive the Shefa of Kedusha and create the Avuvia. Therefore, they are the nations which will reflect it in the Tiferes, in Chochmah, and in the direct reflection of Shefa itself, which is musical development. So here we see this thing. We find that the musical revolution as such came upon certain nations which serve as the vehicles for the redemption of Klal Yisrael. And the way we see it is by the revolution in music and in science in which these nations went. And it is no coincidence that those revolutions in music and science happened at the same time as Klal Yisrael lost its Oris and its Shaykhs to the Yemos Mashiach at the beginning of the time of the Ari and Chaim Vital and the Ramchal. That's not a coincidence. that suddenly you found a tremendous aliyah in Yumas Olam at the same time as you found a Yerida in Klal Yisrael. But this is another variable that has to be considered, the concept of Avuvia. So if we want to explain what is responsible for the fact that different nations of the world produce different types of music, that the same nation itself will produce different types of music over different periods of time, we have to go on to these factors. We have to go on to the concept of Kochas HaNefesh, the concept of Kochas HaNefesh as they relate to Ra and Tov, and the concept of Kochas HaNefesh as it relates to the Avuvia, in terms of the relationship that that nation has to Klal Yisrael. All these factors are responsible and tell us the type of hashpos or shefa that these ummahs will have, and this will come out into the musical development of that nation at any point in time, and any locality on the earth itself. Now the point is, just like these three shefas, the shefa of Ra, the shefa of Tov, and the shefa of Avuvia, affect the different ummahs olam, it also affects the different individuals. So therefore, each person, his shefa also corresponds to these things. So a person will be inclined towards the music depending on the kind of shefa which he has. You see, many times you'll find a person is attracted to both types of music. He finds that he's attracted to music which instills a sublime quality, and he's also attracted to music which instills a low quality. You see, he will be inclined to music which elevates him to a higher spiritual plane, and he'll be inclined to music which causes him to go after certain aspects of the guf. Why? Because obviously that person is an avuvia. His shefa has strong components of both Ra and Tov. You see. So what's explained on a national level can also be explained on an individual level. This more or less concludes our discussion of music at this point, and we kind of have a basic understanding of what music is and how it relates to the hashgacha, how it is a reflection of the hashgacha itself. But what we also have to discuss now is the concept of dancing. Now, dancing is not just stop moving around, but fundamentally, dance itself is a chokhmah. And what dance is, we call choreography, ballet, and modern dance, and so on and so forth, is all the dances themselves in terms of over the periods of time, the minuet, different dances, the waltz that were composed and so on and so forth, or dancing throughout history. That dancing which is done to music is human movements or bodily movements done to music. And we ask ourselves, what is the significance of dance? Because in certain ways, dancing has a greater stimulating effect on a person than music itself, or just listening to music. And when we ask ourselves why, we look into it, we can really see what this thing is. Music, as we said, corresponds to the Shefa process. Now the Shefa process goes down and enters into the neshama. So what happens is, if you want to understand the image of the Shefa process, you listen to music. But if you want to see how the neshama actually responds to that shefa, you look at dance. Because dancing, just like it's the body responding to music, it's just like the body attempting to follow the musical form and the musical notes with specifically bodily motions, so that there's a very great flow and there's a harmony and there's a balance between body movement and musical movement. You see, that same linkage also exists between the neshama and shefa. As the shefa enters the neshama, so to speak, begins to dance. It begins to fill itself. It begins to vibrate and respond to that shefa. That vibration, that response is similar to dancing. So therefore we see that dancing is like music, except that it's beyond music. That music only corresponds to the shefa, whereas dance corresponds to the animation or the activation of the neshama to that shefa. That's why if you hear a nigun and it will affect you much more if you dance to that nigun itself. Because dancing to music is feeling the full force of the neshama being animated by the shefa. So therefore, dancing in many ways goes beyond music itself. and can produce an even more profound effect. The last music form that we would like to discuss is not, we've discussed already music and dance, but I'd like to discuss just a basic idea of art. Now, art has many different forms, but basically what I mean by art at this point is visual art, especially in terms of painting and visual reproductions. And of course, the same thing that we asked about music, we can also ask about art. What is art? What shaykhs that have to ruchnias? Why is it that different people are attracted to different types of art? Why is it that different nations of the world produce different forms of art? And finally, in the same nation itself, there are different periods of art in the same nation, different schools of art and so on. And what is the relationship of art to the hashgacha? I'm not going to go into it extensively. There are many principles which are very similar to the principles in which we've laid down with music. Except that what's very important to understand is that art reflects something different than music. Whereas music represents the Shefa process as it enters into the neshama, art represents the Shefa process as it proceeds from the mashpia. What do I mean? Basically, in every Shefa process there are two things. There's a mashpia and there's a mushpa. The mashpia is that which gives out the shefa, the hashpah, and the mushpah is that which receives it. When the hashpah comes down, when the shefa comes down to the mushpah, and he begins to receive it, the kind of shefa, as it enters him, begins to stimulate him in certain ways. That stimulating process and the way that he feels that shefa corresponds to music. However, the way the shefa emanates from mashpia, certain ways correspond to the union of art itself. When the mashpia gives out the shefa, there are many different hashpos that he's giving out, different types, different variations of hashpah. There are hashpos which vary in, again, like in qualities and so on and so forth, in different aspects of it, in what these hashpos tend to do. When these hashpos come down in one group, you see, that the way they come down in their combinations and in the way they interact with each other, they produce a certain type of shefa in its totality. Art, in many ways, is a reflection of the shefa as it emanates from mashpia. What is art, basically? Art is composed of putting visual images or visual forms, reproducing them. And art also has basic characteristics. The characteristics of art, of course, would be figure, it would be certain design forms, it would be color, it would be shape, it would be shading, black and white, figure ground. All these different things are elements of art. These various different elements determine the kind of visual image that we see. Basically, what determines the visual image are the different lines in the landscape, for example, and the different colors, the shadings, what's figure, what's ground. It's a whole different set of characteristics than you find in music. Now, if you would observe the shefa as it's coming from mashpia, it would also put itself into a certain array or a certain arrangement. And the arrangement in which that shefa is, as it's coming from mashpia, not how it's entering the mushpa, but just simply how it's coming out, and how it's blending and intermingling, and the harmony of the different hashpahs themselves in their various permutations and combinations corresponds to the observation of art. Because fundamentally, art is like observing something. When you look at something, you're not hearing something, you're observing something, you're watching something, you're looking at the balance or the combination, right, of different kinds of properties, visual properties. But it's something which you stand apart from in that way. It's a sight, it's a vision. You're not connected with it in any way, really. And it has a different kind of stimulating effect. The beauty of art is the beauty of form, the beauty of color. But that tends to be a more objective kind of beauty in a sense that it tends to be something which a person observes, rather than what a person feels and responds to in a much more direct and animated way. Art, therefore, represents the harmony of shefa as it's reflected in the harmony of color and in the harmony of form. Music represents the Shefa process itself, as it's coming into the mushba and influencing him, as it generates the power of its feeling and of its animation and such, in terms of the life forces which come into the person. So therefore, music and art in many ways are similar, but in certain ways they're different. Both of them are reflections of a Shefa process. And this is what's critical to understand. They both are. Except that music reflects the Shefa process as it influences or affects the mushba, you see. Because what it is, it reflects the Shefa process as it's coming into the neshama, and as the neshama is responding to that Shefa. Whereas art reflects the Shefa process as it's coming out of the mashpia, as it's being created and as it's being developed, as it's being formed and as it's being mingled together to form a certain type of Shefa before it comes down. This is art in that sense. This is one reason also why many more people are much more attracted to music than art. You have connoisseurs of art, and you have people who are very much into art, but everybody is affected by music. Put on the right tune and everyone gets turned on. But not everyone gets turned on by art, you see. Art requires a sensitivity which is somewhat different. Why? Because fundamentally the ability to be turned on or to be attracted to music, everyone shares, because everyone is the recipient of a hashpah. Since everyone gets a Shefa, everyone in some way relates to the Shefa, everyone therefore in some way can be stimulated by the image of that Shefa, or by the image of the Shefa as he's being affected by it. But art is somewhat different. To be sensitive to art means to be sensitive to the hashpah process as it commences, and as it develops unto itself. You see, that's a different type of sensitivity than to be sensitive to something as it's coming into you and as it's affecting you in terms of your inner experience. So therefore, whereas everyone is influenced by music, not everyone is influenced by art. But in any case, art, or the variations of art development, follow along similar lines of music. Because different hashpahs, or the combinations and permutations of different hashpahs, as they harmonize together to produce that which we finally see coming down, changes over different periods of time, and reflects the koiches of a nefesh, of the ummah, of the individual, and it also reflects the status of tikkun that's going on at the same time too. Therefore, there will be geographical variation in art development. There will be chronological variation. For example, in the history of art, we find that in the beginning of art, they were concerned mostly with accurate reproductions of reality. Whereas over time, they became more concerned with emotional representations or interpretations of reality, in terms of the Impressionists and the Surrealist art forms and modern art, which is the most exaggerated example of that. It's almost a complete denial, you see, of the structure of reality, in the sense that what the artist says is that what's more important is totally how I interpret reality, as if the structure of reality suddenly begins to disappear, and it's the subjective interpretation of reality which is most important. But basically we find a certain evolution where subjective interpretation has become much more important than objective description or representation as such. Now why that is also has to do with the hashgacha process, and has to do directly with the tikkun of mankind as a whole and of each of the ummas ha'olam as well. But one would have to study art more specifically to understand exactly how the change in the historical and the art forms themselves over time are reflected in the changes of the hashgacha, the changes of the tikkun, and of the koiches nefesh of each ummah and of the bria itself. This basically then is a initial attempt to place some kind of understanding on these three experiences which are so common to us and in the lives we lead, namely musical experience, dance experience, and finally artistic experience. And what we see very interestingly is that all three of these have very clear-cut connections and associations to ruchnius, that in some way they are direct reflections of ruchnistic processes, and as such all are subject to the specific movement and evolution of the hashgacha itself. And that just like the hashkoch itself is concerned with the ultimate tikkun, from chesoron to shlemus, and from tumah to tahara, these three forms will reflect art, dance, and music will reflect that as well. And finally, to make one more note, since art, music, and dance basically are physical manifestations of a ruchnistic Shefa process, in the Yemais Mashiach, when that Shefa process will be tremendously exalted and sublime, because it will represent a Shefa of tremendous awe, we would also think that the music and art of that time will be also totally different. And that is actually true. If we could understand the inner dynamics of music and its pneumius, and if we had some shaykhs to understand what that awe is in the Asad Lava, in the Yemais Mashiach, we could actually create the musical notes and melodies which will exist at that time. Because in truth, just like there's a music which represents La, and there's a music which represents Tov, there's also a music which represents Shleimus. And we all have to ask ourselves, what does music sound like that represents perfect being, that represents a world in a state of Shleimus? It must be an incredible type of music, because to sit and listen to that music probably would produce an ecstatic experience which nothing that we have ever heard of can produce. This is really what follows from our entire discussion, that there exists the perfect music, just as there exists the perfect state of tikkun, and that someday the world, and Klal Yisrael specifically, will be zeicha to that kind of music. And in all possibility and probability, and actually what it was, is that Klal Yisrael was zeicha to a certain state of music in a much higher form in the Beit HaMikdash. We do not know what that music was, but there's no question that that music was obviously a reflection of the Shefa at that time. And since the Shefa at that time represented a Bria, which was in a much higher state of Kedusha, and albeit not necessarily in a higher state of Tikkun, because that was not established then music must have reflected also the same thing. But Lasad Lavo in the Yemais Mashiach, the music will reflect not only a higher state of Kedusha, but a state of Tikkun as well. And it would be an amazing thing to hear that type of music. No question that if we would hear that type of music today, we would all literally experience such an ecstatic thing that it would literally put us to almost like a stupor state, or almost like a state where we would be almost shocked. And it would be interesting to play such a thing, just an experiment, if we had that kind of music, to see the reactions. Because suddenly everyone would suddenly become completely attracted to that music and begin to feel totally in harmony with that. Because all men seek shleimus. And it is in the basic inner part of all mankind, in terms of feeling his own chasson, to want that shleimus. And therefore all men would respond to that music basically in a similar way. But of course that will only be zeicha to in the Zman of the Mashiach itself. But all this flows from our entire discussion, that since music, art and dance reflect these earths, they must reflect these earths in their various different states. And there must be a music, art and dance which reflects the highest earth, just like there's a music, art and dance which reflects a lower earth, and a music, art and dance which reflects an Avuvia state of earth. And this ends the discussion of this topic.